A young 19-year-old girl, bleeding feet wrapped in bandages, crawling under a piano in a deserted rehearsal room, sobbing uncontrollably because the man the world adored had just broken her spirit. That girl was Debbie Reynolds, and the man was Gene Kelly, Hollywood's golden boy, the charming dancer who made millions fall in love with him as he splashed through puddles singing in the rain. But behind that million-dollar smile and those graceful dance moves was a man so demanding, so controlling, so ruthlessly perfectionist that some of Hollywood's biggest stars swore they would never work with him again. This is the story of why Hollywood truly feared Gene Kelly, and it's not the fairy tale you've been told. When you think of Gene Kelly, you think of joy, don't you? You think of that iconic scene where he's dancing in the rain, umbrella in hand, with not a care in the world. You think of the athleticism, the innovation, the way he transformed movie musicals into something spectacular and groundbreaking. Gene Kelly wasn't just a dancer. He was a triple threat who could act, sing, and dance with equal brilliance. He was a director, a choreographer, a visionary who changed the very language of cinema. But here's what they don't tell you in the highlight reels and tribute montages. Gene Kelly was also one of the most difficult, demanding, and at times cruel figures in Hollywood's golden age. The very perfectionism that made him a genius also made him a tyrant, and the people who worked closest to him paid the price. Let's start at the beginning, because Gene Kelly's story isn't one of overnight success or natural talent falling into place effortlessly. Eugene Curran Kelly was born in Pittsburgh in 1912, and dancing was absolutely not his first choice. In fact, when his mother enrolled him and his brother James in dance classes at the tender age of 8, young Gene resented every single moment of it. The neighborhood boys called him and his brother sissies, and that label stung. It stung so badly that fistfights became a regular occurrence, and Gene Kelly learned early on that if you wanted to survive, you had to be tougher than everyone else. You had to prove yourself. Eventually, he quit dancing altogether, unable to bear the teasing and the constant need to defend his masculinity with his fists. But life has a funny way of bringing us back to the things we're meant to do, doesn't it? At 15, Gene Kelly gave dancing a second chance, and this time, things were different. He was older now, more confident, a robust athlete who no longer feared the bullies who had once intimidated him. More importantly, he had discovered something crucial. Dancing was an incredible way to attract women. Suddenly, those dance moves that had once made him a target became his greatest asset in the dating game. Kelly had plans, though, plans that didn't necessarily include a career in entertainment. He wanted to study journalism, to have a respectable career away from the stage. But then, 1929 happened. The stock market crashed, the Great Depression descended upon America like a dark cloud, and Gene Kelly's family, like millions of others, found themselves desperate and struggling. Desperation makes us do things we never planned. Gene Kelly dropped out of school immediately and, along with his brother Fred, turned back to the one skill that could bring money into the household: dancing. They performed in nightclubs, entered talent contests, did whatever it took to win prize money and keep their family afloat. It was grueling work, the kind that builds character or breaks you entirely. For Gene Kelly, it built something else: an ironclad determination never to be vulnerable again, never to be in a position where he couldn't control his own destiny. By 1932, the Kelly family had opened a dance school, and Gene threw himself into it, but teaching was never going to be enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted to perform, to be recognized, to prove to the world and to himself that he was exceptional. Broadway came calling, and Gene Kelly answered. He worked hard, paid his dues, took roles where he could get them, and then in 1940 everything changed. He landed the lead role in a production called Pal Joey, and suddenly, Gene Kelly was a name people knew. But this is where the darker side of his personality began to reveal itself, the side that would later terrorize co-stars and collaborators. It was during Pal Joey that Gene Kelly's reputation as an unflinching, uncompromising perfectionist truly took root. His co-star Ben Johnson recalled something that still haunted him years later. Late one night, after everyone else had gone home following a grueling rehearsal that had lasted from 8 in the morning until midnight, Johnson heard something as he descended the stairs. staccato steps echoing from the stage. He looked back and saw a lone figure under a single lamp, still dancing. It was Gene Kelly, rehearsing the same moves over and over and over again, never satisfied, always pushing for something more. That dedication sounds admirable, doesn't it? That's the kind of story we love to tell about great artists, about their commitment to their craft, their refusal to settle for anything less than perfection. But here's the thing about perfectionism. It becomes a weapon when you start demanding it from everyone around you with the same ruthlessness you demand it from yourself, and that's exactly what Gene Kelly did. When Hollywood came calling in 1942, Kelly was ready, or so he thought. His first film was For Me and My Gal, opposite the legendary Judy Garland, and despite the opportunity of a lifetime, Kelly was terrified. He later admitted he felt appalled at the sight of myself blown up 20 times on the screen, believing he was a tremendous flop. He wasn't, of course. He was magnetic, unnatural, but that insecurity, that constant feeling of not being good enough, would drive him to demand more and more from himself and from everyone who worked with him. 2 years later, Kelly made CoverGirl, and this is where he truly began to assert his control. Columbia Pictures gave him complete creative control over the production, a rare privilege for an actor, especially one still relatively new to Hollywood. Kelly seized that opportunity with both hands and revolutionized how dance was filmed. He implemented trick photography that allowed him to dance with himself on screen, a technical marvel for its time. He removed soundstage walls so he could film entire dance sequences in single takes with Rita Hayworth and Phil Silvers. He was innovative, brilliant, pushing boundaries that nobody else had thought to push. But that innovation came at a price, and the people who worked with him were the ones who paid it. Let's talk about Singin' in the Rain, because if any production exemplifies both Gene Kelly's genius and his cruelty, it's this one. The film is consistently ranked as one of the greatest musicals ever made, a joyous celebration of Hollywood's transition from silent films to talkies, featuring some of the most iconic dance sequences in cinema history. Behind the scenes, however, it was a very different story. Debbie Reynolds was only 19 years old when she was cast in the film, a young actress with gymnastics training but absolutely zero experience as a dancer. She was thrown into the deep end with Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor, two men who had been dancing professionally for years, and Kelly made it very clear from day one that he was not happy with the casting choice. Debbie Reynolds later described Gene Kelly as a cruel taskmaster in her memoir Unsinkable, and she didn't use those words lightly. She wrote about how Kelly came to rehearsals and criticized everything she did, never giving her a single word of encouragement, constantly making her feel inadequate and unwelcome. Imagine being 19 years old, living your dream of being in a major Hollywood musical, and having your co-star and director, because Kelly was both, treat you with nothing but contempt. Reynolds had 3 months to learn what Kelly and O'Connor had been perfecting for years, and instead of helping her, guiding her, or showing even the smallest amount of patience, Kelly pushed her relentlessly, criticized her mercilessly, and broke her down systematically. The rehearsals for Singin' in the Rain were legendary for all the wrong reasons. Take the Good Morning number, that bright, cheerful song that makes audiences smile and tap their feet. To create that 3-minute sequence, Gene Kelly, Donald O'Connor, and Debbie Reynolds rehearsed for 15 hours straight, from 8 in the morning until 11 at night. By the end of it, Debbie Reynolds' feet were bleeding, and she had to be physically carried off the set. She spent the next 2 days in bed recovering, while Kelly, presumably satisfied with the take, moved on to the next sequence. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was how Gene Kelly operated. He drove himself hard, yes, but he drove everyone else just as hard, with no regard for their experience level, their physical limitations, or their emotional well-being. But it gets worse, and this is where we cross from demanding perfectionism into something far more troubling. During the filming of one of the romantic scenes, Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds had to film their first kiss. Now, remember, Debbie Reynolds was 19, innocent, raised in a conservative household, and this was the 1950s. Gene Kelly was 39, a married man, experienced in every way Reynolds was not. When the camera rolled and Kelly leaned in for the kiss, he didn't just kiss her. According to Reynolds' own account in her memoir, he shoved his tongue down her throat without warning, without her consent, without any discussion beforehand about what the scene would entail. Reynolds was shocked, horrified. She broke away from him and ran off the set, shouting for Coca-Cola so she could rinse out her mouth. She wrote, "I was an innocent kid who had never been French-kissed. It felt like an assault. I was stunned that this 39-year-old man would do this to me." Let that sink in for a moment. Gene Kelly, the man the world adored, the charming dancer who represented everything wholesome about Hollywood's golden age, sexually assaulted his teenage co-star on set, and it was just accepted as part of the business. There were no consequences, no repercussions. Filming continued, and Reynolds, traumatized but professional, had to keep working with the man who had violated her boundaries so completely. And here's the truly disturbing part. This kind of behavior wasn't unique to Kelly. It was part of the culture of old Hollywood, but that doesn't excuse it, and it doesn't make Kelly any less responsible for his actions. The physical toll Kelly's perfectionism took on his cast was equally brutal. During one particularly traumatic day, Kelly's relentless criticism and impossible standards drove Debbie Reynolds to a complete breakdown. She sought refuge in a deserted rehearsal room, crawled underneath a piano, and sobbed her heart out, convinced she couldn't do it, that she wasn't good enough, that she was going to fail and disappoint everyone. And who found her there? Not Gene Kelly, the man who was supposed to be directing her, mentoring her, bringing out her best performance. No, it was Fred Astaire, Kelly's great contemporary and supposed rival, who discovered Reynolds hiding under that piano. Astaire was the one who offered her comfort and encouragement, telling her, "You're not going to die. That's what it's like to learn to dance. If you're not sweating, you're not doing it right." Fred Astaire, in one moment of kindness, showed more humanity and understanding than Gene Kelly had shown Reynolds in months of working together. Debbie Reynolds wasn't the only one who suffered under Gene Kelly's demanding regime. Cyd Charisse, one of the greatest dancers of the era, a woman with years of training and experience, also had her complaints about working with Kelly. According to Charisse, Kelly often manhandled his dancing partners during rehearsals and performances, leading them with such force and aggression that they regularly ended up with bruises all over their bodies. Charisse said her husband could tell immediately who she'd been dancing with just by looking at her when she came home. If she was covered in bruises, she'd been working with Gene Kelly. If she was unmarked, she'd been dancing with Fred Astaire. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark, and it raises an important question. If Fred Astaire could achieve the same level of perfection, the same spectacular results, without leaving his partners physically battered, why couldn't Gene Kelly? The answer, I think, lies in Kelly's personality, in the deep insecurities and aggressive competitiveness that drove him throughout his life. Gene Kelly wasn't just competitive in his professional life. He was competitive about everything. Volleyball games, casual sports with friends, any activity that could have a winner and a loser became, in Kelly's hands, a fierce battle that he absolutely had to win. Bob Fosse, himself a legendary choreographer and director, once said about Kelly, "I'd never seen anyone so fierce about a so-called friendly game in my life." He had a competitive streak in him that was quite frightening. This wasn't the behavior of a confident man comfortable with his abilities. This was the behavior of someone constantly trying to prove something, constantly afraid of being exposed as somehow inadequate. That competitiveness led to some truly bizarre incidents. In one famous story, Gene Kelly was playing volleyball with friends and colleagues, just a casual game that should have been fun and relaxing. Kelly's team lost, and he was so enraged, so unable to accept defeat, that he stomped his foot on the ground in frustration. He stomped so hard that his ankle broke. Yes, Gene Kelly broke his own ankle because he lost a volleyball game. The injury was serious enough that he had to drop out of Easter Parade, a film he was supposed to star in with Judy Garland. Fred Astaire, who had actually retired from dancing at that point, came out of retirement to replace Kelly in the role. The irony is almost too perfect. Kelly's inability to control his temper and accept a loss in a meaningless game led directly to his rival getting one of the great roles of that era. But Kelly's perfectionism wasn't just directed outward at his co-stars and collaborators. He was equally, if not more, critical of himself. Despite his success, despite being one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, despite revolutionizing the movie musical, Gene Kelly never believed he was good enough. He hated watching himself on screen, constantly comparing himself unfavorably to other actors. He considered himself a competent stage actor, but only passable in films. He obsessed over every gesture, every facial expression, every line reading. Kelly once said, "I would have loved to have been as good an actor as Spencer Tracy or Marlon Brando," a statement that reveals just how deeply his insecurities ran. Here was a man who had achieved what most people only dream of, who had created some of the most memorable moments in cinema history, and he still felt like he wasn't good enough. These insecurities manifested in his relationships with other performers, particularly with Esther Williams, the famous swimming actress who starred with Kelly in Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Williams did not mince words when describing her experience working with Gene Kelly. She called him a jerk and described her time on the film as pure misery. What was Kelly's crime against Williams? He hated that she was taller than him. That was it. In scene after scene, Kelly demanded that Williams slouch, that she make herself smaller, so he would appear bigger. In one particularly absurd moment, Kelly complained that Williams even sits tall when she was literally just sitting down. The insecurity of a man so threatened by a woman's height that he would make her entire working experience miserable is almost comical if it weren't so pathetic. Let's talk about Stanley Donen, because if any relationship exemplifies Gene Kelly's complexity and his difficulty in maintaining professional partnerships, it's his collaboration with Donen. They met when Kelly was starring in Pal Joey on Broadway, and Donen was just a 16-year-old chorus boy, starstruck and eager to learn from the star of the show. Kelly took Donen under his wing, becoming a mentor, and as the years passed, Donen became Kelly's assistant, his collaborator, and eventually his co-director on some of the most important films of the era. It was the classic mentor-protege relationship, and for a while, it worked beautifully. Together, they created On the Town, Singin' in the Rain, and other classics. But as Donen grew into his own as a director and creative force, as he moved from dutiful assistant to equal partner, the relationship began to fracture. Gene Kelly, for all his talent and vision, was not good at sharing control or credit. Compromise wasn't his strong suit. Years later, long after their collaboration had ended, Stanley Donen finally spoke publicly about what it was really like working with Gene Kelly. Even then, even decades removed from their partnership, Donen was careful, almost reluctant to speak ill of Kelly. He acknowledged Kelly's genius, calling him one of the wonders of the 20th century, but then he added something that cast a very different light on the beloved star. Donen said, "What I didn't like, and I know this is not appropriate now, was his manner off-screen. He could be difficult with me and everyone else. It was always a complicated collaboration. It wasn't always the happiest thing." Those words, carefully chosen and diplomatically phrased, speak volumes about what Donen must have endured. When someone describes a working relationship as not always the happiest thing, decades after it ended, you can bet the reality was far worse than they're willing to say publicly. But there was another factor in the breakdown of the Kelly-Donen partnership, one that's even more dramatic and speaks to Gene Kelly's complicated personal life: Gene Coyne. Gene Coyne was Gene Kelly's assistant, a talented dancer and choreographer in her own right who helped develop what became known as Kelly's signature style. She worked closely with Kelly on the Town and other productions, and there was clearly a connection between them, but Coyne ended up marrying Stanley Donen, Kelly's friend and collaborator. It seemed like an odd choice, and as it turned out, it was a troubled marriage from the start. When Kelly's own marriage to his first wife, Betsy Blair, began to crumble, Gene Coyne saw her opportunity and made a stunning confession. She was in love with Gene Kelly. She had apparently been in love with him for years, had married Donen perhaps hoping those feelings would fade, but they never did. Imagine being Stanley Donen, learning that your wife was in love with your closest collaborator and friend. The betrayal must have been staggering. The already complicated working relationship between Kelly and Donen became impossible, and their partnership ended. Shortly after, both Kelly and Coyne divorced their respective spouses and married each other in 1960. They had 2 children together, Timothy and Bridget, and for a while, it seemed like perhaps Gene Kelly had finally found happiness. But tragedy has a way of finding people, doesn't it? Gene Coyne was diagnosed with leukemia and died in 1973 at just 50 years old, leaving Kelly a widower with 2 young children. After Coyne's death, Kelly swore he would never marry again. He'd been married twice, lost one wife to cancer, and at 61 years old, he seemed content to live out his remaining years alone, focusing on his children and his legacy. But then, in 1985, something happened that would cause one final scandal in Gene Kelly's life. He met Patricia Ward, a 26-year-old writer who was working on a documentary about the Smithsonian Museum. Kelly was 73 years old, and this young woman had never even heard of him. She didn't know who Gene Kelly was, had never seen Singin' in the Rain, had no idea she was working with one of Hollywood's greatest legends. To her, he was just a very elegant man, and perhaps that was exactly what Kelly needed, someone who saw him as a person rather than as the icon he'd become. Their working relationship developed into something more, and 5 years after they met, Gene Kelly and Patricia Ward got married. She was 31. He was 78. The age gap was 47 years, massive even by Hollywood standards, and it caused exactly the scandal you'd expect. Kelly, perhaps aware of how it would look, lied to the press about Ward's age, claiming she was 36 instead of 31, as if those 5 years would somehow make the relationship seem more appropriate. Patricia Ward herself seemed unbothered by the age difference, later saying, "He was so terribly handsome. He didn't seem old to me." She even said she preferred meeting Kelly in his later years because "I got him when he didn't have to prove anything to anyone," which is a fascinating statement when you think about it. Even his wife recognized that the younger Gene Kelly, the one at the height of his fame and power, would have been difficult to be with, perhaps impossible. Kelly and Ward had only 6 years together before his health began to fail dramatically. He suffered a stroke in 1994, was hospitalized for weeks, seemed to recover, but then had another stroke in 1995 that left him severely disabled. He died on February 2, 1996, at the age of 83. The world mourned the loss of a legend, one of the greatest dancers and entertainers who ever lived, and that's absolutely true. Gene Kelly was a genius. He transformed movie musicals, brought a masculine athleticism to dance that opened the art form to male performers who might otherwise have been dismissed as sissies, the way young Gene himself had been. He innovated cinematography techniques specifically to showcase dance in ways that had never been done before. He directed, choreographed, starred in, and created some of the most joyous, uplifting, technically brilliant pieces of entertainment in cinema history. But here's what we need to understand. Genius doesn't excuse cruelty. Talent doesn't give someone license to abuse, manipulate, or traumatize the people around them. Gene Kelly was both things. He was a brilliant artist and a difficult, often cruel person to work with. Those two truths coexist, and pretending one doesn't exist doesn't honor anyone, least of all the people who suffered under Kelly's perfectionist tyranny. When Stanley Donen was approached to participate in the documentary about Kelly's life after Kelly's death, he refused. He told the filmmakers that he didn't have anything kind to say, so he'd rather not say anything at all. That level of bitterness, maintained for decades, speaks to wounds that never healed, to trauma that couldn't be forgiven even after Kelly was gone. So, why did Hollywood fear Gene Kelly? It wasn't because he was violent or threatening in the traditional sense. It was because working with Gene Kelly meant subjecting yourself to impossible standards, relentless criticism, grueling physical demands, and emotional brutality, all in service of his vision of perfection. It meant knowing that no matter how hard you worked, it might never be good enough for him, because it was never good enough for him even when he looked at himself. Co-stars refused to work with him again not because he lacked talent, but because the psychological and physical toll of meeting his expectations was simply too high a price to pay. Think about the famous title sequence from Singin' in the Rain. that iconic moment that defines Gene Kelly for most people. What you see on screen is pure joy, a man so happy he's dancing and singing in the pouring rain, splashing through puddles like a kid without a care in the world. What you don't see is that Kelly was running a fever of 103 degrees when he filmed it. He was sick as a dog, should have been in bed, but he refused to postpone the shoot because all the preparations had been made, the set was ready, and Gene Kelly didn't believe in wasting time or resources. So he danced in artificial rain for a day and a half straight, feverish and exhausted, because that's what his perfectionism demanded. It's admirable in a way, that level of commitment. It's also deeply disturbing when you realize he expected the same from everyone else regardless of their circumstances. The water for that sequence had to be mixed with milk so it would show up properly on camera. The set had constant problems with the pipes and water effects, causing delays that stretched the shoot longer than anticipated. Kelly danced the same routine over and over, take after take, in wet clothes that grew heavier by the minute, while fighting off fever and fatigue. The result is one of the most iconic sequences in film history, a moment of pure cinematic magic that has brought joy to millions of people across generations. But at what cost? Donald O'Connor, Kelly's co-star in Singin' in the Rain, had his own health crisis during the production when he filmed the Make 'Em Laugh number. O'Connor, trying desperately to keep up with Kelly's standards, threw himself into wall flips and pratfalls with such reckless abandon that he ended up hospitalized, bedridden for several days after completing the sequence. The number is brilliant, one of the greatest solo comedy dance performances ever captured on film, but O'Connor quite literally destroyed his body to achieve it. This was the culture Gene Kelly created on his sets, one where physical destruction was not just accepted, but expected in pursuit of perfection. And here's the thing. Fred Astaire created equally magnificent, equally innovative, equally perfect dance sequences without leaving a trail of traumatized, injured co-stars in his wake. Astaire was known for being demanding, yes, for requiring many takes, for insisting on excellence, but he was also known for being a gentleman, for treating his partners with respect, for never leaving them bruised or broken or crying under pianos. So the question becomes, was Kelly's cruelty necessary for his genius, or was it simply a character flaw that Hollywood tolerated because his talent was undeniable? I would argue it's the latter. Gene Kelly's brilliance and Gene Kelly's brutality were separate things, not two sides of the same coin. You can be a perfectionist without being cruel. You can demand excellence without destroying people's spirits. You can push for greatness while still treating your collaborators with basic human decency. Kelly chose not to do those things, and that's on him, not on some abstract notion of artistic temperament or the demands of genius. When we Leoneize difficult artists, when we excuse their behavior because that's just how creative geniuses are, we do a disservice to the countless artists throughout history who have been brilliant and kind, innovative and compassionate, demanding and respectful. The MGM studio system, under which Gene Kelly worked for most of his greatest films, was itself a complicated machine that both enabled and constrained him. On one hand, the resources available to Kelly at MGM were extraordinary. He had access to the best dancers, musicians, cinematographers, and technical crews in the world. The studio gave him unprecedented creative control, trusting his vision even when it required expensive innovations and technical experiments. This was the era of the Arthur Freed unit at MGM, a golden age of movie musicals that also included legends like Vincente Minnelli and Kelly's frequent partner Stanley Donen. The films produced during this period, An American in Paris, Singin' in the Rain, On the Town, The Bandwagon, are considered some of the finest musicals ever made, and Kelly was at the center of many of them. But the studio system also meant that actors and actresses had very little power to choose who they worked with or to speak out about mistreatment. If MGM cast you in a film with Gene Kelly, you worked with Gene Kelly, period. You didn't have the option to say, actually, I've heard he's difficult, I'd rather not. Your career, your contract, your entire future in Hollywood depended on being professional, being cooperative, and not making waves. So when Gene Kelly made Debbie Reynolds' life miserable, she couldn't quit. When he manhandled Cyd Charisse, she couldn't file a complaint. When he sexually assaulted Reynolds during that kiss scene, there was no HR department to report it to, no #MeToo movement to give her voice amplification. She just had to take it and keep working because that's what being a professional meant in that era. This is important context for understanding why Kelly's behavior went unchecked for so long. It wasn't that nobody knew he was difficult. Everyone knew. It was an open secret in Hollywood that Gene Kelly was a taskmaster, that he was hard on his co-stars, that working with him was an ordeal. But his films made money, they won awards, they pushed the art form forward, and in Hollywood, success covers a multitude of sins. As long as Kelly kept delivering hit after hit, as long as audiences kept buying tickets to see him dance, the studios had no incentive to rein him in or to listen to the complaints of the actors and actresses who suffered under his direction. Think about Kelly's relationship with Frank Sinatra, another massive star with a reputation for being difficult. They worked together on Take Me Out to the Ball Game and On the Town, and while they were friendly on screen, behind the scenes, there was tension. Sinatra was used to being the biggest star on any set he walked onto, used to things being done his way. Gene Kelly was used to having complete control over every aspect of production, especially the dance numbers. Two massive egos, two men used to getting what they wanted, forced to collaborate. It's no wonder sparks flew. But here's the interesting thing. Despite any personal tensions, Sinatra and Kelly managed to create something magical together on screen. Their chemistry in On the Town is undeniable, their joy in the dance numbers infectious. It's a reminder that even when relationships behind the scenes were complicated or even antagonistic, these were professionals who understood how to deliver when the cameras rolled. Gene Kelly's athleticism was genuinely revolutionary for movie musicals. Before Kelly, male dancers in Hollywood tended to follow the Fred Astaire model: elegance, sophistication, tuxedos and top hats, smooth ballroom moves that made everything look effortless. Kelly brought something completely different. He danced in jeans and sneakers. He incorporated gymnastics and acrobatics. He made dance look powerful and masculine in a way it hadn't before in American popular culture. For young boys who might have been interested in dance but feared being mocked as sissies, Gene Kelly provided a different model, proof that you could be athletic and masculine and still be a dancer. In that sense, his impact on American culture extends far beyond just the films he made. Kelly's choreography also broke new ground in how dance was filmed. Before Kelly, dance numbers in movies were typically shot from a fixed position, essentially treating the camera like an audience member in a theater. The dancer would perform, and the camera would record it, but there wasn't much creative interplay between the dance and the cinematography. Kelly changed all that. He understood that film was a different medium from stage, with different possibilities. He used the camera as a partner in the dance, with sweeping crane shots, tracking shots that followed him down streets, angles that no theater audience could ever see. He thought about how to use the entire frame, the entire space of the screen as part of the choreography. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then, and it's one of the reasons Kelly's dance numbers still feel dynamic and exciting today, while some other films from that era feel more static. The Broadway melody sequence from Singin' in the Rain, where Cyd Charisse plays the mysterious woman in green, is a perfect example of Kelly's cinematographic innovation. The sequence is essentially a standalone short film within the movie, telling its own story through dance with minimal dialogue. The camera work, the lighting, the way the space is used, it all serves the choreography and the narrative Kelly is trying to tell. It's a 13-minute sequence that showcases everything Kelly was capable of: the athletic dancing, the emotional storytelling through movement, the technical innovation in how it's filmed. And yes, it's also where Kelly's physical intensity with his partners is on full display. Watch Cyd Charisse in that sequence, at how forcefully Kelly moves her around, and remember what she said about coming home covered in bruises when she danced with him. Kelly's experimentation extended beyond just choreography and cinematography. He was one of the first to successfully combine live action with animation, dancing with Jerry the Mouse in Anchors Away, a sequence that required incredible technical precision. Kelly had to dance with perfect timing to match animation that hadn't been created yet, essentially performing with an imaginary partner and trusting that the animators would be able to make it work in post-production. The result was magical and groundbreaking, paving the way for future films that would blend animation and live action. Later, he did similar work in Invitation to the Dance, an anthology film that was entirely dance with no spoken dialogue, another risky experiment that demonstrated Kelly's willingness to push boundaries and try things that conventional wisdom said wouldn't work. But for every innovation, for every moment of brilliance, there's a story of someone who paid the price for Kelly's vision. Take An American in Paris, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1951 and features one of the most ambitious dance sequences ever put on film, an 18-minute ballet at the end of the film set to Gershwin's music. It's stunning, a genuine work of art that deserved every accolade it received. Leslie Caron, Kelly's co-star and dance partner in the film, was just 19 years old when she made the movie, and while she's spoken more diplomatically about Kelly than some of his other co-stars, she's also acknowledged how grueling the experience was, how demanding Kelly was, how little room there was for error or weakness. This pattern repeats throughout Kelly's career. Young, inexperienced actresses thrown into intense dance numbers with a perfectionist director/choreographer/co-star who showed little patience for their learning curve. It's hard not to wonder if Kelly specifically chose less experienced dancers because they were easier to control, less likely to push back against his methods, more intimidated by his reputation and status. An experienced dancer like Cyd Charisse could at least hold her own professionally, even if she went home covered in bruises. But teenagers like Debbie Reynolds and Leslie Caron, what defense did they have against a man with all the power who seemed determined to break them down? Hollywood in that era was rife with this kind of exploitation, of course. The studio system treated actors, especially women, as property to be managed and controlled. Power imbalances were baked into every level of the industry. Gene Kelly was far from the only difficult, demanding, sometimes cruel director or co-star. But he was one of the most celebrated, one whose reputation has largely survived intact despite the stories his co-stars have told. When we talk about Fred Astaire, we talk about elegance and grace and professionalism. When we talk about Gene Kelly, we still mostly talk about innovation and athleticism and joy, glossing over the cruelty and control that characterized his working methods. Part of this is timing. Kelly died in 1996, well before the #MeToo movement, before social media gave voices to people who had been silenced or ignored by traditional media, before there was much appetite for critically examining the beloved figures of Hollywood's golden age. Debbie Reynolds' memoir, where she detailed her experiences with Kelly, wasn't published until 2013, 17 years after Kelly's death. By then, he'd been gone long enough that the stories read more like historical curiosities than urgent calls for accountability. Cyd Charisse died in 2008, Esther Williams in 2013. The people who could tell the most complete stories about what Gene Kelly was really like are mostly gone now, leaving us with fragments, hints, carefully worded criticisms that don't quite capture the full picture. What we're left with is a complicated legacy. Gene Kelly genuinely changed movie musicals, genuinely innovated, genuinely created moments of joy and beauty that have endured for decades and will continue to endure. Singin' in the Rain is a masterpiece. There's no other word for it. An American in Paris is a work of art. These are films that deserve to be celebrated, studied, preserved. But we can celebrate the work while also acknowledging the human cost of creating it. We can recognize Kelly's genius while also recognizing his cruelty. These aren't contradictory positions. They're both true simultaneously. The fear Hollywood had of Gene Kelly wasn't the kind of fear that comes from physical danger or threats. It was the fear of never being good enough, of being broken down and diminished, of having your spirit crushed in service of someone else's vision of perfection. It was the fear that comes from knowing that no matter how hard you work, how much you sacrifice, how much pain you endure, it still might not be enough. For young performers especially, being cast in a Gene Kelly film must have been simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The opportunity to work with a legend, to be part of something that might become a classic, but at what personal cost? Compare this to working with Fred Astaire, and the difference is striking. Astaire was demanding, absolutely. He was famous for requiring take after take until everything was perfect. But he was also a gentleman, respectful to his partners, never physically aggressive, never cruel. Ginger Rogers, who danced with Astaire in 10 films, had plenty of complaints about the working conditions, about doing everything Astaire did except backward and in high heels, about not getting equal billing or recognition. But she never accused him of cruelty, never said he made her feel worthless or inadequate. The demands Astaire made were professional, not personal. That's a crucial distinction. In his later years, after Gene Coyne's death, Gene Kelly seemed to mellow somewhat. People who worked with him on projects in the 70s, 80s, and 90s generally reported that while he was still exacting in his standards, there was less of the volcanic temper, less of the cruelty that had characterized his earlier work. Perhaps age softened him. Perhaps losing his wife to cancer gave him perspective on what really mattered. Perhaps he simply had less to prove. Patricia Ward's comment about getting him, when he didn't have to prove anything to anyone, suggests that even those close to Kelly recognized that his worst behaviors came from a place of insecurity and the need to demonstrate his worth. It's worth considering what drove Kelly to be the way he was. The childhood teasing about being a sissy for dancing, the financial desperation of the Depression years, the constant comparisons to Fred Astaire, the insecurity about his acting abilities, all of these things created a man who could never feel secure in his accomplishments, who always had to be the best, had to be in control, had to prove himself over and over. That doesn't excuse his behavior, but it perhaps explains it. Gene Kelly's cruelty came from a wounded place, from someone who had been hurt and diminished, and who responded by becoming someone who hurt and diminished others. The competitive volleyball game, where he broke his own ankle, is almost a perfect metaphor for Kelly's entire approach to life. He pushed so hard, demanded so much, was so unable to accept anything less than victory that he literally broke himself. And in doing so, he lost the role in Easter Parade to the very man he was constantly being compared to, the man whose effortless elegance was so different from Kelly's athletic intensity. The universe has a sense of irony sometimes. What's particularly sad is that Kelly's self-doubt, his constant feeling of inadequacy, was completely unjustified. He was brilliant. He was innovative. He created things that no one else could have created. If he had been able to see himself the way audiences saw him, if he had been able to accept that he was genuinely exceptional, perhaps he wouldn't have needed to be so brutal to everyone around him. Perhaps he could have channeled that perfectionism into something constructive rather than destructive. We'll never know, of course. We only have the legacy he left, which is both magnificent and troubling. The story of Gene Kelly is ultimately a cautionary tale about the cost of genius, about how talent doesn't excuse harm, about how the most beloved public figures can be the most difficult private individuals. It's a reminder that we should listen to the stories of people who worked behind the scenes, who weren't in positions of power, who paid the price for someone else's art. Debbie Reynolds, Cyd Charisse, Astaire Williams, Stanley Donen, these people all tried to tell us what Gene Kelly was really like, and for the most part, we didn't want to hear it. We wanted to preserve the image of the charming dancer splashing through puddles, not confront the reality of the cruel taskmaster who left his co-stars bleeding and traumatized. So yes, Hollywood feared Gene Kelly. They feared him because he was uncompromising, because he demanded perfection, because working with him meant subjecting yourself to standards that were often impossible and methods that were frequently cruel. They feared him because he had the talent and the studio backing to get away with behavior that would have ended lesser careers. They feared him because once you were cast in one of his productions, there was no escape, no option but to endure until filming was complete. And perhaps most of all, they feared him because some small part of them wondered if maybe he was right, if maybe that level of cruelty and perfectionism was necessary to create something great, even though Fred Astaire's career proved definitively that it wasn't. Gene Kelly died in 1996, leaving behind a complicated legacy of extraordinary films and damaged people. Patricia Ward, his widow, has spent the years since his death working to preserve his legacy, to keep his films and contributions in the public eye. She's done interviews, written about their relationship, defended him against criticisms. That's understandable. She loved him, and she experienced a different Gene Kelly than the one Debbie Reynolds or Stanley Donen knew. People are complicated, capable of great kindness to some and great cruelty to others. Gene Kelly was undoubtedly kind and loving to Patricia Ward. He was also undoubtedly cruel to Debbie Reynolds. Both things are true. The question for us, looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, is how do we hold both truths simultaneously? How do we appreciate Singin' in the Rain while acknowledging what Debbie Reynolds went through to make it? How do we celebrate Kelly's innovations while remembering the bruises on Cyd Charisse's arms? How do we recognize genius while also recognizing harm? There's no easy answer, but pretending the harm didn't happen, ignoring the testimony of the people who suffered, is not the solution. If anything, it dishonors both Kelly's legacy and his victims. The full truth, complicated and uncomfortable as it is, serves everyone better than a sanitized myth. Gene Kelly was a genius who revolutionized movie musicals. Gene Kelly was also a cruel perfectionist who traumatized his co-stars. He was an insecure man driven to prove himself who could never find satisfaction in his achievements. He was an innovator who pushed the boundaries of what dance on film could be. He was a man of his time, operating within a system that enabled and rewarded his behavior. He was also personally responsible for the choices he made, for the way he treated people, for the harm he caused. All of these statements are true. All of them matter. And all of them are part of the answer to why Hollywood truly feared Gene Kelly. Not because he was a monster, but because he was a complicated, deeply flawed human being whose brilliance came packaged with cruelty, and nobody knew quite how to handle that then, and we're still figuring out how to handle it now.